everyone. Hello, and welcome to our conference on short-termism in European corporate governance, organized by the University of Antwerp, Harvard Law School, and European Corporate Governance Institute, ECGI. Thank you for joining us, both in person and online. We also have a lot of people following online. Feel free at any point during the conference, vote in people online and to ask also questions in the chat, and we can also ask those questions to our speakers so that they can respond. I also want to thank very much our financial sponsor, HIMF. HIMF is a Belgian private equity firm. They also have some of the people from HIMF in the room following what we are doing. They're very much interested in good corporate governance, and we are very grateful for them for supporting us through the journey towards this conference. We're also grateful to the partners of the Jean-Pierre Bloemberg Chair. The Jean-Pierre Bloemberg Chair is a chair here at the University of Antwerp that does research, teaching, and event organizing around corporate governance, in particular short-termism in corporate governance lately. And it's also thanks to the financial support of the partners of the chair that we've actually are able to organize events like the one today. Thank you also to all of the speakers and discussants and panelists who joined us here today. We are very happy that everyone was willing to come, sometimes from very far away. We have people from overseas, from United States, Canada. We have people from very close by, some speakers from Belgium, Paris, Italy. So quite a diverse group. And yeah, thank you. I think you are going to make this conference a very interesting one, I'm sure. And also, thank you very much to Mark Roe, co-organizer of the conference. I think I started getting interested into the topic of short-termism in corporate governance by reading Mark's work, his papers, and also by taking his class on corporate governance when I was studying myself at Harvard Law School with Mark. I'm very happy that we're able to co-organize this conference now. Mark, I think, has already been writing for years about this topic, but he also recently published a new book on short-termism, which I think is a great book, and I recommend everyone who is interested in this topic, which probably includes everyone listening to this conference, to read the book. And I think that Mark is now going to present some of his research coming from the book. He won't have time to speak about the whole book, I imagine, but it's going to be a nice teaser. So, Mark, I think I'll give you the floor with that.
Okay. Thank you, Tom. Good to see people in the audience, several former students who've done well, and colleagues and the like. If you have an opportunity to co-organize a conference with Tom, my advice is take it, because Tom does a great job in getting everything done, and you might only have to do along the lines of what I did as well. It'd be interesting to hear her on X or hear him on X. I've read the paper. I've read the book. It would be good to see this in person, and it's a nice way to participate as a co-organizer of a conference and not have to deal with the nitty-gritty of raising the money and making things happen. So, stock market short-termism with a question mark. The aim of the 25 or 30 minutes of this talk and of the book that I put together a year ago is, what can we distill from what we know about stock market short-termism for public policy making and for public policy makers? And I break it down for us into 4 issues for us to think about today. First, and surprisingly, I think, what is stock market short-termism? For something that we know in discourse for securities regulation and corporate law is very prominent, I think we don't have a good definition and a good understanding of what actually is stock market short-termism, at least in public discourse. Second, what does the evidence tell us about stock market short-termism? How bad is it? Where is it? And then what should we do about it? What are the cures and what are their costs? If you're still with me, and not everybody will be in agreement on the three things that I'm going to present on each one of these issues, then there's a fourth question, which is why is there so much attention to stock market short-termism when, I'm going to argue in the next few minutes, when we properly look at what stock market short-termism is, it's a much narrower economic and corporate feature than it's usually seen to be. So let's go through these 5 or 10 minutes on each of them. What is stock market short-termism? So here's something from the World Economic Forum, the Davos people. The finance world, short-termism will destroy our communities, economies, and the planet. So it's stock market short-termism that's contributing to the destruction of the planet and climate degradation. The EU's Sustainable Corporate Governance Project from a couple of years ago was rife with this kind of a syllogism. Sustainability is long-term. Stock market trading is short-term, sometimes ultra-short-term. Therefore, make the stock market more long-term in order to make the underlying companies more sustainable. And you see a fair amount of this in United States Securities and Exchange filings when people are arguing over whether to tighten this rule or loosen this rule. Critics pointed out, and I include myself as one of the critics, Jesse Fried, Holger Spahman, and Charlie Wang and I wrote a submission, that the climate issue is primarily an externality issue, and the time horizons of individual investors is not a critical feature in the climate issue. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment or two. And here's a summary. It's not clear whether the authors are putting forth a statement as their own view or whether they're describing the statement as, putting the statement forth as a description of the reality of what people are thinking. But central to the ESG movement are criticisms that companies are too short-term oriented, linking ESG with short-termism, and thereby exposing themselves to long-term risk and generating externalities that are harmful to society. The general idea here, or the general criticism, is these two things should be separated, externalities and time horizons. So Venn diagram will do the job. Here's corporate short-termism. Things where a company favors current profits, let's make an extra dollar today, over long-term profits, even though we'll make $2 2 years from now, more than enough to compensate for the ongoing cost of capital. So corporate short-termism, where the firm is itself harming itself by favoring $1 today instead of $10 years down the road, is what I'll call core corporate short-termism. There's something else out there that is frequently conflated with that kind of corporate short-termism, social short-termism. So favoring short-term corporate profits over long-term social value. But the argument that I'd make, or I am making, is that the critical feature is favoring corporate profits, whether in the short term or the long term, over social value. And the time horizon isn't particularly critical. So a firm that pollutes over the long run is no less despicable because it's doing it as a long run strategy for the firm than a firm that pollutes over the short run. Basically, what's happening is society is short term by not doing enough things to internalize the externalities that companies produce. But each firm is quite plausibly being completely long-term or satisfactorily long-term but is deciding that since it can put the externalities off on others, it will put the externalities off on others. So a little bit more detail. So there's some overlap here, and not enough time to go through the overlap, probably related to compensation policies and the like. Instead of calling the social problems social short-termism, just think of them as social problems in general. And a half dozen features that are important to corporate structure. 3 of them fit nicely on the left. 3 of them don't fit nicely on the left, but are often conflated with stock market short-termism. So if a firm fails to invest when it has a good project, but its project will not come to fruition for 5 years, and for one reason or another, quarterly reporting or the like, the company simply doesn't undertake that project, this is quintessential corporate short-termism, and it's something we should be concerned about if it's big. We might conclude that there's not much we can do about it, and we just have to let different arrangements in the corporation reduce the problem, but it's quintessential corporate short-termism. Research and development. If research and development is declining, this is kind of a failure to invest, because companies are concluding that the expense is now for R&D. We could make money, but the benefit is 5 years, 10 years down the road. And even though we could make money on this project, we don't do it because we need to report good earnings right now. This is corporate short-termism. Stock buybacks. Jesse and Taylor are going to talk about this later, so I'm just going to skip over this. But one of the bêtemnoires of short-termism is draining companies' cash, purportedly then leaving the firm less able to operate. All those 3 things are real corporate short-termism, and if we see a lot of it, we should be concerned. There are other things that are called corporate short-termism, but are really systemic short-termism, and are not necessarily and usually not due to the corporation itself being short-term. So damaging the environment and the planet. Damaging the environment and the planet is primarily due to actors' capacity to internalize the profits and externalize the costs. And it doesn't make a whole lot of difference whether this externalization is long-term, short-term, or otherwise. Firms could have a very strong policy. Firms that do hydrocarbons could be thinking about what they'll look like 20 years from now and not be particularly concerned about the costs that are leveled on the rest of society. Mistreating stakeholders. If stakeholders are mistreated, it doesn't become better because they're mistreated over the long run as part of a long-term policy. It's a cost or a problem regardless of the time horizon. Yet frequently in policy debates, the claim is made because of the stockholders and the company's preference for short-term profits, it mistreats stakeholders. This could be a short-term policy or a long-term policy. Less prominent today in 2023 than it was in 2009, but there's a lot of talk during the financial crisis of 2009, 2010, that financial institutions were taking short-term risks and that this was damaging the entire economy. Better analysis would be that financial institutions could take risks, and a significant portion of the downside of those risks were borne by people outside the economy, workers who lost their jobs, people who lost their homes, and this is an externalization problem, not a time horizon problem. So the conclusion I draw from this is, in public discourse, since all of these things are viewed as stock market short-termism, but the things on the left are potentially, if real and important, true stock market short-termism, and the things on the right are social problems or the system being short-term. Stock market short-termism, because it conflates the two in public discourse, sees it as a much bigger problem than it is, when it's really the problem on the left, not the problem on the right. A little bit of an anecdote. Consider ExxonMobil or Royal Dutch Shell or Total. Climate change critics say the companies are too short term and are therefore producing and burning too much hydrocarbon. ExxonMobil is not a short-term operation. There are people and units inside ExxonMobil that are thinking about how the oil market is going to look like in 2035, 2045. They're not an organization that can't think and doesn't think long-term. What it is they're looking to see whether the electric car will really displace the automobile by 2035 and what that will mean for the burning of hydrocarbons. It's not a time horizon problem vis-a-vis ExxonMobil or I suspect Total or Royal Dutch Shell. It's an externalization problem. Why does this matter? So a criticism of everything, even if you accept everything I've just put on the table for you, a criticism of it could be, well, what's the difference? So we have a mixed up vocabulary. Maybe academics want to precisely set out the differences, but for public policymakers, since the goal here is what can public policymakers get from what we know about stock market short-termism, the claim could be, a counter could be, well, to make an issue prominent in public discourse, sometimes we have to take shortcuts. And if it helps to vilify polluting companies by calling them short-term, that actually may help the environmental movement. And since I consider myself kind of a green person on these issues, I might be sympathetic to this. The reason I'm not so sympathetic to this is I think in policymaking discourse, it leads to bad decision-making. So if we really think that we can make ExxonMobil pollute less, produce less hydrocarbons by thinking in terms of what will happen in 2040, we'll undertake some maybe corporate governance measures to push it along that margin. But if one, it's not necessary because they're already thinking about what's happening in 2035. And two, it doesn't matter because the problem is externalization, not time horizon. We'll adopt a solution that is not a solution. And that's bad. It won't get us to think about what the real problem is and what we have to do with it. And it's also, this is the last part, it's also an opportunity for some interest to co-opt some of the arguments in stock market short-termism, which I don't know whether it's happened in Europe. I don't quite know enough, but it surely has happened in the United States. So the argument is, do this thing to reduce stock market short-termism, frequently reducing power of shareholders and increasing power of managers. And it's frequently an argument that's brought forward by managerial spokespeople. The problem of climate change will be improved. So conclusion of this part one, or this first question, is policymakers in the media tend to see stock market short-termism as a major debility, holding back the economy overall. And the message is don't over-aggregate problems. Too much of what's considered stock market short-termism is not a pure or even any time horizon issue. It's an externality issue. The first question to think about. Second question to think about, there's not enough time to really go through this in a lot of detail, so I'll do one thing in detail and some of the generality. What does the evidence tell us about stock market short-termism? What does the evidence tell us about stock market short-termism in the core sense of firms overly favoring current profits over long-term well-being of the firm? It's mixed. One of the things I did is to pull every high-quality article from the likes of the American Economic Review and Journal of Finance and the like, and they're pretty much split down the middle. About half the articles are saying we're looking for stock market short-termism in a place where we should find it, and we don't find it. The other half, usually related to some quarterly reporting issue, say we're looking at stock market short-termism in a place where it's been most prominent, quarterly reporting, and we can find something here. So it's mixed. Good studies are coming out both ways. There's also big picture perspective, including something that's just not well addressed. So one, as I said, it's divided. Two is on some of the big trends in at least the American economy. There's not strong evidence that the stock market is causing a problem that's worse today. So one of the arguments that's sometimes made is that R&D is declining because of stock market short-termism. And when you look at the numbers, it's not declining in the United States. It's growing faster than the economy is growing. Maybe I should skip over this. It conceivably, with a different set of arrangements, it would grow even further. But in terms of let's look at what our problems are and let's do something to mitigate our problems, when the short-termist critics look at stock market short-termism, they're not looking at something that's sinking, at least in the United States. They're looking at something that's growing and growing substantially. More and more is being invested in R&D. Maybe better arrangements would lead to us investing even more. There's a conceptual issue in the literature that I don't quite know why it's not addressed, other than that it's really hard to address. It's the partial equilibrium problem. So for a policymaker, what should be of concern is not whether there's some group of companies that aren't doing as much R&D as they should otherwise, or aren't investing as much as they should otherwise, but whether the economy overall isn't doing as much R&D as it should otherwise, or not investing overall as much as it should otherwise. Here's what I mean. Even when we get a study that shows that, say, firms that do have some class of firms that have stock market options for senior management coming due this quarter, invest less or do less R&D in that quarter, that's a problem. And that's a problem. That's a real problem. And I think the studies that show this are quite good. For a public policymaker, they really should want to know an additional fact. If my firm does less R&D this quarter because my stock options are coming due, that then presents a profit opportunity for your firm where the stock options are not coming due. The question for an economy-wide perspective is, do you pick up enough of my missed investment so we really don't have a big economy-wide problem? In economics generally, people pay a lot of attention to the partial equilibrium problem. For reasons that escape me, other than that it's very hard, people don't pay much attention to the partial equilibrium problem for stock market short-termism. One or two papers that hint somewhere along those lines. But what we really would want to know for public policy purposes is that even if I invest less, do you pick it up? Or does some other sector of the economy pick it up? And do you pick enough of it up? Pick 80% of it up at relatively low frictional costs. We have so many other problems. This is a problem that should drop. Spend a couple of minutes. Spend a couple of minutes on one study. What there is out there is a lot of firm-level studies, sometimes finding stock market short-termism, sometimes not finding stock market short-termism, frequently finding it in relation to quarterly reporting. So let me talk about this for a minute. Again, the idea is, can we distill something from the academic literature to give advice to Congress? Speaking of this as an American, if Congress were willing to listen, on what should be done about stock market short-termism. So as I said before, the studies are divided. There's one major study which I've long found to be the most convincing that there is a noticeable stock market short-termism related to quarterly reporting. As I read and reread the study, I come to the conclusion that there's less stock market short-termism there than it first seems to be. So the headline from the study, and it's a famous study, probably a good portion of the people in the room have read it or know of it. Graham Harvey and Raj Gopal, high-end, world-class finance economists, did something very straightforward and simple. They interviewed, sent questionnaires to chief financial officers of firms, and they asked them, if you were not about to make your quarterly numbers, you couldn't smooth earnings and go up your 5% from last year, would you sacrifice value? And the answer came back, 78% said yes. And that's the headline that gets reported on a regular basis, that 78% would indeed sacrifice value to avoid an earnings downturn year to year. There are a bunch of kind of techie problems in the paper, which the authors, as I said, they're world-class finance economists, recognize and deal with. The return rate was not particularly high, 10%, and so you don't know whether the people who are most worried about the problem are returning and saying, yes, we have too much stock market credit. It's what executives think they're doing. It's quite plausible that what the stock market has been doing is sending a firm a signal that future investment is not a good idea because they're a bricks and mortar retailer and Amazon is going to put them out of business eventually unless they change path, so don't invest more in stores. The third is 78% said if the circumstances arise, we'd sacrifice. But that's not the same thing as 78% said we're sacrificing value. Most firms meet their quarterly numbers just as a matter of course. They plan well, they execute well, and if the firm grows whatever, the 3%, 5% that they wanted to grow. 78% were saying if we were in this bad state that we, because we're a great firm, never find ourselves in, we would sacrifice value. It's not that 78% said they were sacrificing value. It's that 78% said that they said that they would. There's also another issue, which is what leads, since maybe this is my prior view that stock market short-termism is a small problem, it was easy for me to see this coming out of the paper. Where did the 78% come from? So this is the graphic from the paper. About 25% said, 22% said no, we wouldn't sacrifice any value. A few percent said we'd make a large sacrifice. About a quarter said we'd make a moderate sacrifice. And over 50% said we'd make a small sacrifice. The way this is always aggregated in media reporting is 78% said we would sacrifice. But you could aggregate this in a different way. You could take the none and the small and aggregate them and conclude that despite all this talk in the media and among policymakers about stock market short-termism, 75% say that we would not make anything more than a small sacrifice of profit to make our numbers on a quarterly basis. And again, as I'm saying, for policymakers, a small problem, since we've got so many big problems, should be way down the list on what we pay attention to. And this is just a verbal version, written version of what I said. Interest of time. Well, an anecdote I think illustrates. COVID hit us in 2020. The projections in the United States over the first couple of quarters were that earnings would decrease over 40%. And the actual decrease in earnings was about 30%. What happened to the stock market? There was a blip down, and then during the worst part of COVID, the stock market rose. Only one instance of the stock market reaction to a problem. But what we end up seeing is that in the 6 worst months of COVID, when there were basically the stock market was concluding there will be a vaccine, probably. There will be a way of dealing with this, probably. Earnings are down, and they're down tremendously. And the earnings among American companies were really crushed in 2020. But this is a short-term problem that's not going to affect the way we value firms right now. Unemployment hit post-World War II highs in the United States during this period. It's only one example, but this is not a good example for stock market short-termism. So conclusion I reach is from the evidence. One is we don't have enough evidence and about whether this is a system-wide problem or a problem for a targeted subset of firms from most of the studies, the partial equilibrium problem. And there are a bunch of theoretical reasons that would be nice if they're confirmed or studied empirically. A bunch of theoretical reasons to think that when my firm foregoes an investment, it then gives you an opportunity, creating a problem for my firm, but not really a deep problem for the economy overall. Cures and their costs. I'm not going to say too much about this, although it deserves a lot of attention. Many of the cures involve weakening shareholder power inside the corporation, or at least many of the cures proposed in the United States involve weakening shareholder power inside the corporation. They're proposed in the belief that management is more long-term than shareholders, but that's a questionable proposition. We have now index funds that basically do not sell stock; they hold stock forever, and it's not obvious who is more short-term, long-term management or stockholders. And there are different ways that firms can reconfigure themselves. We're going to talk later about loyalty shares that plausibly could have some effect on whatever short-termism there is. It's worth discussing. Each one of the cures either, I think, does not hit the problem directly, or when it does hit the potential problem, if we do have a problem, the cures have costs that really have to be weighed carefully in the balance. Why the over-attention to stock market short-termism? That is, if you're with me on the first three issues at least a little bit, then the next question would be, there seems to be a lot of over-attention to stock market short-termism. It plays a big role in policymaking at the Securities and Exchange Commission in the United States. Delaware corporate law judges think about stock market short-termism on a regular basis. It's one of the extremely few corporate governance issues that senators and candidates for president have some familiarity with, enough to mention in some speeches and the like. Why is there so much over-attention to stock market short-termism? It's not a question that you'd be interested in if you think stock market short-termism is, in fact, a deep and profound problem for the economy and society. But if you do think some of these things, then the explanations are something lying with the interests. There are people who do profit from stock market short-termism being exaggerated in the public sphere. Executives and boards. So as I've mentioned a couple of times, this comes up regularly in the United States when there are proposals to shift power, or that could shift power, between managers and stockholders. And usually it's executive interests who are bringing forward the short-termism argument. Give more authority to managers. Managers are inherently long-term. That will solve the problem. There's a second channel, and it's a second public choice channel, which gets a little bit less attention. Employees and social critics of the large corporation seek to and often succeed successfully in co-opting the short-termism argument. And then there's a psychological aspect. We just tend to think that long-term is inherently better than short-term. But for financial markets and for business, that's not necessarily true. So long-term investment in, the cliche is buggy whips, is not something to applaud a corporation for doing. Short-term scramble to get a COVID vaccine available in 3 to 6 months is something to be applauded. We could change the words around and think of the long-term as being obstinate and the short-term as being flexible and adaptable, and then short-term starts to look better when we use adaptability. Traders seem to be short-term. Therefore, if we're anchored in wanting things to be long-term, let's dampen trading. Roy Shapiro and I went through this, and we think successfully, in looking at the psychological reasons why we inherently favor things that are labeled long-term and inherently disfavor things that are labeled short-term. But let me return to the interest and then conclude. In corporate discourse in the United States, and I know less about whether this discourse is the way it happens in Europe, there's been a long trend of managers bringing forward the idea that stock market short-termism is a problem, and actions by investors, particularly activist investors, is a core source of stock market short-termism. Something that's only rarely confirmed in the data. So here's Martin Lipton, a long-term, most prominent spokesman for boards and executives, a lawyer, and he says, and I'm looking at this, 1979. The issue is whether the long-term interests of the corporate system and the economy should be jeopardized in order to benefit a quick profit. So he deftly contrasts the long-term interests of the economy with the short-term interests of financiers, and says the right solution is to give more authority, in this case, to defeat takeovers to executives and boards. Fast forward from 1979 to 2023, and it's almost the exact argument from a managerial spokesman, Lipton again. The purpose of the corporation to maximize short-term profits or operate in the interest of all its various stakeholders to promote the long-term value of the corporation. If we really think stakeholders are important, why should it matter whether the sacrifices of short-term profits or long-term profits? If our goal is to create a fairer society or benefit other stakeholders, it shouldn't make any difference whether we are focused on short-term profit making or long-term profit making. Now, here's the other interest group or idea that plays a role in stock market short-termism, and then I'll be done. As I said before, corporate governance issues do not engage the attention of national politicians in the United States, with one or two exceptions: stock buybacks and stock market short-termism. So here's Joe Biden running for president around the time he's running for president, and he says, short-termism, the notion that companies forego long-run investment to boost near-term stock price. It's not just a problem, it's not just a technical problem for 30 people in a conference room to focus on and then put together some recommendation. It's one of the greatest threats to America's enduring prosperity. And who pays for this? In the summer before he took office, when he's giving some statements of what this plan would be, he's asked about working class wages. And when asked to describe the forces that are flattening working class wages over the decades, he says there are two big things. One is Republicans in Congress, that's what you'd expect Biden to say. And the second is Wall Street forcing business leaders to focus obsessively on the short term. So there's a second political, social media channel for stock market short-termism. That is, if I want to criticize American capitalism, notwithstanding the rise of Bernie Sanders, being a socialist in the United States is not a winning formula for getting a seat in the Senate. If you want to criticize American capitalism in the United States, typically you can't do it straight on and say, I don't like the capitalist order for this reason or that reason. It's much more legitimate to say, and my former colleague Elizabeth Warren says this almost the way I'm presenting it, I'm in favor of capitalism. Nobody's more capitalist than I am. What I'm not in favor of is short-term capitalism that devastates stakeholders. What I'm in favor of is long-term capitalism that benefits stakeholders in the right sort of way. So one of the reasons why stock market short-termism plays a big role in public discourse is, I believe, because it facilitates these two political and policy channels. And as I say, the reason why it's important to make this difference is because it crowds out better solutions, and it can be used, it can be co-opted by people to get their preferred policy position. So, concluding slide, 4 issues. What is it? It's too wide, as it's generally perceived. What does the evidence tell us? I think nothing definitive. What are the cures and their costs? I really didn't discuss this, but every cure has a cost, hard to tell which one. And why the over-attention to short-termism, interests, and psychology. Thank you.
And then we now have more 10 minutes time for questions, both from people online, if they want to type in the chat, or also people in person.
Very interesting presentation, so thank you. Now, it seemed like you blamed all the possible corporate short-termism on stock market short-termism. But the two things are not necessarily the same. And in fact, my sense often is that, you know, organizations are short-termist for other reasons, you know, bad incentives, the way people get promoted, you know, things that people feel they need to do in the short run to even be able to stay in their firms. And so it's, despite the stock market not being short-termist, the firms may still be short-termist.
I agree with that. There could be internal things in the organization of the firm that lead it to make mistakes. All organizations and all people make mistakes, and some of those things can be short-term. Could also be long-term. Firms sometimes have a habit of staying with a project for years longer than it's really worthwhile. And at least I'm not completely sure whether firms tend to be too long-term in the sense of sticking with a bad project for an extra 5 years, or too short-term and killing a good project before it really comes to fruition. It's probably both simultaneously, too short-term and too long-term. It would be nice to know whether firms are on average too long-term or too short-term. And, you know, if we had a lot of confidence in policy making, maybe we could tweak the dial to push it in the right direction. I tend not to have confidence that we are good enough to be able to tweak the dial, or at least I don't have confidence that the United States Congress is capable of tweaking the dial.
Hans?
Yes, Hans de Wolf, Ghent University. My impression is, but I must stress it's not backed up by any empirical evidence, that in Europe we have potentially two types of short-termism problems. On the one hand, and I think Tom will talk about this, controlling shareholders, blocking transactions that are in the long-term interest of the company. And secondly, when you talk to people that have been targets of private equity takeovers, you often hear the story that these private equity investors cause payouts, so dividend payouts, because they need to pay back the loans or the leverage they took on, and that private equity activity might be detrimental to the position of employees in companies. Now, before 2000, I saw some research by financial economists on this latter question, but are you aware, or is anybody in the room, Zacharias Soutner or Jesse Fried, who's going to talk about payout, is there anything empirical to your knowledge about the impact on R&D investment and payout ratios of a firm being taken over by a private equity investor? Of course, last thing I want to add, in many people's view, private equity investors, since they're there for about 5 years often, are not short-term investors, but the anecdotes suggest they do have an effect on payout ratio and R&D investment. But I don't know whether there's any systematic research on that.
I hesitate always to say what the empirical literature says off the top of my head, because I always want to go back and reread, and I'm sometimes surprised what I thought I remembered is not exactly. But the answer to the question of what I remember now, but check this. Wei Wang, Alan Brav, and I think another cohort had looked at this kind of thing for the United States, and what they found was, as I'm recalling, somebody may recall this better, that investment in R&D declined somewhat, but the effectiveness of the R&D increased. Now, it's an empirical study, and I have to use all kinds of odd measures of a number of patents granted or patents cited to see whether it's really high quality as a measure of high quality research. But this would be suggestive that the private equity firms are doing what you're describing, forcing payouts, but creating better research results. In the world is wonderful story, it would be private equity is targeting firms that are spending too much on some kind of research and reducing that and increasing the research output of things that are going to be more effective and more useful.
Maybe I'm going to use my privilege as moderator to also add something to that. Last year, I taught a class on corporate short-termism to my students, and we had one of the lectures was partially on ownership structure, including private equity. And then I presented a small review of the literature, and I think it's a very mixed story in the sense that most of the evidence suggests private equity adds a lot of value for the shareholders themselves, so they increase profits and profitability, creating a lot of value for shareholders. And then the evidence regarding stakeholders, that's a bit more mixed. And I think there's also maybe a difference in Europe and in the US here. For example, there's some papers that employment goes down, but then other papers also find that actually it increases again in the long term. There's one paper that's often cited that finds that actually environmental pollution goes down because of private equity, because they actually have a higher compliance with regulation. But then there's also some papers who find a negative effect on mortality in hospitals for hospitals run by private equity funds and care homes. So I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. I think it also depends to how large extent on regulation, and they may the impact of regulation may dampen somewhat the impact on stakeholders. Any other questions?
Yeah. Mark Wiegert, KU Leuven. I have two questions for you. First question is, I think we see in the market that some shareholders have a short-term horizon. It's I think a fact, and we've seen it in Europe where institutional shareholders as of the 90s started to be present in the market, and I think empirical evidence does point out to the fact that they have short-term horizon. In your view, does that not have any influence then, the fact that we have more and more shareholders with short-term vision? And second question, which is kind of looking forward, I heard you mention that in the US, the wrong policy choices made by focusing on the management instead of the so-called short-term shareholder. In Europe, we are trying to cut down the influence of the controlling shareholder because we have this different shareholding structure. That may not be the solution either. So if we should not focus on those issues, we do have those societal problems. What should we focus on? Or are we abusing corporate law to handle problems that should not be handled by corporate law?
So on the second question, for me at least, that's easy, is that I think there are a lot of social problems that we shouldn't be expecting corporate law to handle. We just can't do it. And by trying to do it, we may degrade the things, we will degrade the things that we really can do. So on the first one, that undoubtedly are shareholders who, for one reason or another, are discounting, are only looking to what profit they can make in the next year or so. How should we think about that? Well, one way we should think about that is there's a range of time horizons, perhaps, inside shareholders. It's possible that even the short-term shareholders are looking to turn over their stock in the short term, but since they have to sell it to somebody to make their profit, they have to sell it to somebody who thinks there's long-term value inside the firm. But there's another way to look at it, which is for stockholders to affect management seriously, deeply, there has to be some sort of a coalition between the short-term shareholders that you're pointing to and longer-term shareholders. And here's what I mean. For a typical activist shareholder, who's usually the target, who's thought of as being too short-term. Some people may question as to whether they're really short-term, but for critics, an activist shareholder is, by definition, short-term. And what I put on the table is that even if the activist shareholder is hopelessly short-term, it can't implement its short-term program without forming a coalition with longer-term shareholders. So a typical activist in the United States, might be different in Europe, will pick up 7 to 15% of the stock of the company. To be taken seriously by management, if somebody has 7 to 15% of the stock of the company, management, the CEO, the board might be polite to the 15% holder, but not do anything the 15% holder wants to do, because 15% isn't enough to displace the management. Maybe they could cause some embarrassment or a proxy fight. The thing that would give the 15% stockholder some sway with the board of directors, the CEO, and management is to be able to go into a conference with management and say, yes, we only have 15% of the vote, but the index funds, which own about 30% of your company's stock, Fidelity, Vanguard, State Street, who are not going to sell your stock, just the way they're constructed, they will not sell your stock. They're talking to us sympathetically. And we, the activist, says to management, we think we have their votes. You can assess it for yourself. That is the worry of management some significant fraction of the time. It's not that the short-term, it's not just that the short-term shareholder is going to cause some havoc for the firm. They can't really have deep influence unless they're able to convince some significant number of other voters, or convince management that some significant number of the other shareholders, many of whom will never sell the stock, are going to vote for the activists in the next proxy fight.